Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kirsten Wiley, and I'm here today to introduce and welcome Eric Liu, who is visiting us as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Eric Liu is here today to discuss Imagination First, Unlocking the Power of Possibility. This book introduces us to a wide variety of individuals who have learned how to make a habit of imaginative thinking and creative action. When imagination becomes a habit, it can transform your work and your life. Imagination First offers a set of universal practices that anyone can use to transform their life at work, at home, and at play. With stories drawn from the lives of leaders, teachers, scientists, artists, and other diverse professionals, Imagination First is a guide for practitioners of a possibility at any scale and in any sector. Eric Liu is the founder of the Guiding Lights Network, dedicated to mindful and imaginative mentorship. His previous books include Guiding Lights, How to Mentor and Find Life's Purpose, the official book of National Mentoring Month, The Accidental Asian, Notes of a Native Speaker, a New York Times notable book, and the national bestseller, The True Patriot, which he co-authored with Nick Hanauer. A former White House speechwriter and senior advisor to President Bill Clinton, Eric is now an educator and civic entrepreneur in Seattle. Please join me in welcoming Eric Liu to Microsoft.
Thank you very much, Kirsten, and I want to thank all of you for making it out this afternoon. It's really lovely to get back to the Microsoft campus. I didn't get to tell you about this, but about 13, 14 years ago, I spent a lot of time on the campus as Slate Magazine and MSNBC were getting launched, and spent a summer living in Redmond and spent a lot of time here. So it's always, whenever I see the Azteca as I pull off of 520, I'm like, oh, I'm back home, so it's a nice friendly feeling. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of a roadmap of what I wanted to speak about this afternoon, and I'll try to keep my comments fairly compact so we can just have a good give and take and a conversation here for the balance of the time. As Kirsten mentioned, this new book that I've written, that I think a number of you have had a chance to at least get, if not read, is called Imagination First. My co-author, a fellow named Scott Brandon, is the executive director of the Lincoln Center Institute, which is the outreach and education arm of the Great Performing Arts Center, Lincoln Center in New York. And we came together in collaboration in ways that I think themselves instantiate why we think imagination matters. A previous book of mine, Guiding Lights, about great life-changing mentors, has yielded now every year in January a national gathering, a conference called the Guiding Lights Weekend that we hold at Seattle Center. It's actually coming up January 29th and 30th this year. And it's a very playful, experiential conference on the art of mentorship, leadership, and community building. And the spirit of that conference is meant to really infuse play into this work and to remind folks that the art of mentoring is as much art as anything else, and that the work of mentoring itself at the core is about cracking open someone else's sense of possibility and imagination about what they can do, what they can be, how they move in the world, what they're capable of. And it was through the Guiding Lights Weekend that we began to collaborate with the folks at Lincoln Center, because they, in their own parallel path as a great performing arts center, were trying to think about, okay, we in the arts get imagination, but how can we start fostering conversations outside of just the arts about the role and the centrality of imagination to a vibrant, healthy, diverse society? And so they began looking all around the country for partners they could play with, who could spark just these kinds of conversations that really bridged the gap from the self-selected crowd of folks within the arts to other domains and professions. Well, that's how we began to collaborate around Guiding Lights Weekend. And the more we collaborated, the more we realized that there was something here that needed to be done first. And that was just to define terms and explain to folks in the first place why we think imagination matters. And so the three chunks of stuff that I'd like to talk about this afternoon are just the what, the why, and the how of this book and of imagination. The what And what we mean when we say imagination is something very specific. We don't mean it just in a generalized, interchangeable sense with innovation, with creativity, and so forth. That's the way in which I think a lot of people, when they hear that word, it's just lumped together in this kind of broad, net of concepts. But the reason why the book is titled Imagination First is that we've got a point of view that says that these three things, imagination, creativity, and innovation, are actually distinct, and they're part of a continuum. That imagination, if you define it as a capacity to conceive of what is not, to conceive of what is not, that's the foundation of everything. That's where everything starts. That ability, both cognitive and emotional, psychological, to go where people aren't going, to ask what people aren't asking, to imagine what is not, to conceive of what is not. Imagination applied, when you do something with that cognitive and social emotional capacity, that's creativity. And then creative acts, which can run an incredible gamut, if those creative acts themselves somehow advance the state of the art, move the ball forward, that's innovation, right? Now, in American life, at Microsoft, in the business world, in academia, in research, everywhere you go, we love to worship at the altar of innovation. We want innovation now. We want to celebrate innovation. Where's the next innovation? We want to find it. We want to celebrate. We want to highlight it. But to simply focus on innovation like that and to wish for it to kind of pop up and show up is like hoping for fruit to appear without the seed. And this, we think, is a problem that's endemic. It's across the business world. I spend a ton of my time in Washington State on public education. I serve on the State Board of Education. I'm co-chairing the Seattle School Levy right now. And in education, same kind of thing. We want results, we want accountability, we want innovation, but we don't particularly tend to the garden of imagination. We don't tend to the ways in which these habits of this capacity get formed. That's the what. Well, why? Why does this matter? In our view, this is not just some abstract ontological, philosophical discussion about defining terms and making these distinctions and whatnot, right? To us, it matters centrally. I'm preaching to the converted here. Here we are at Microsoft, in Building 99, in the home of Microsoft Research. People out in the world can say, well, this place is it's an operating system machine, so they're just printing money, right? Because Windows is out there and they don't have to do anything. Well, everybody in this room knows that's not true. That this company, as great as it is only going to be great for another generation to the extent that imagination is cultivated here, that imagination gets turned into creativity, and that creativity yields some innovation, whether it's in Microsoft Research or just in your day-to-day practices of how you do any of your jobs in any part of this organization. But take it up one level, right? It's not just Microsoft, it's our economy generally. Nationally, if you think about the American economy, and if you think about Washington State's economy in particular, there is one thing that at the end of the day, no matter how much globalization, no matter how much outsourcing, no matter how much tech infuses itself into the processes of commerce, one thing that cannot be outsourced, and that is our native capacity for imagination. And so if we want, as a state and as a country, to retain a competitive advantage, and watching the ways in which slice after slice of the salami of economic work gets outsourced, right? You realize there is a core here that can't be given away. But at the same time, it is not automatically self-generating or self-renewing. We have to be mindful and intentional in every institution and organization that we're in, whether it's in the world of business, in the world of education, in the world of parenting, in the world of mentoring, which I spend a lot of time on. We have to be intentional about how we cultivate imagination. It matters when you think about particularly the next generation. I'm a parent. I have a daughter who's in 5th grade right now. And some of you may know, if you spend time with anybody who's 10, 10 is one of those years where that metamorphosis begins to happen. The shift from this incredibly open, non-boundary drawing, non-distinction making child full of wonder to an eye-rolling teenager, right? Who's making judgments constantly, and who's making judgments about her judgments, and who's putting things into categories and boxes and assigning things their proper place, right? And as I watch that, I think, okay, well, part of that is a necessary aspect of socialization and growing up. And part of it is a darn shame, right? Part of it is just a darn shame. And as a parent, my responsibility is to try for as long as I possibly can, in as sustained a way as I possibly can, to hold that thread of that wide-eyed wonder and that sense of awe and possibility and boundarylessness. And it's not to say that we as working adults, people with responsibilities, can or ought to just be frivolous and childlike in a pejorative way. But every one of us would do well, and Microsoft as an organization would do great to the extent that each one of you gets to be more childlike in your mindset, in your approach, in the way you play together, in the way you either draw lines or don't draw lines. And so, it matters for how we raise the next generation. That's a huge part of the why. Well, the book itself, Imagination First, has a front piece that is about this kind of what and why, and a little short essay that just frames up the issue. But the heart of this book is 28 and a half practices that Scott and I have drawn from all these different domains and realms, as Kirsten was saying, from the arts, from science, from diplomacy, from politics, from the sports world, from the media business, whatever. All these practices that people use to cultivate imagination. And that's the how. And we have a theory of action here, which I think is worth making explicit, which is that imagination, contrary to one of the myths that I think a lot of people, just folk wisdom, hold, imagination is not one of those things that you either got it or you don't, right? If you just walk out in the street and just ask people, kind of, confront them and say, what do you think about imagination? Are you an imaginative person? Chances are oh, no, that's not me. I'm not one of those types. I know some imaginative people, but that's not my thing. I do X, or I do Y instead, or I'm good at this thing, but imagination is not really my gig. And part of our underlying point here is that imagination is everybody's gig, right? This is a native, innate, human capacity. Now, it's not developed equally in all of us, and in some cases it's quite squelched. And we operate in environments that either reward or don't reward imagination. But it is not a thing where, magic fairy dust that's been sprinkled on some and not on others. We all have it. And if you recognize that we all have this capacity, then it becomes not just of academic interest. It becomes almost a moral obligation to think about, well, then how do I develop it? If I have it, if my child has it, if my coworker has it, if my boss has it, if my subordinates have it, not cultivating it, this act of omission is nearly criminal, right? And one of the other myths that obtains about imagination is that it's not teachable. So you might come along with me as far as I've gone and say, okay, I get that everybody has imagination, but, how do you actually cultivate it in somebody else? How do you lead people or manage people or mentor people in a way that cultivates and develops their imagination? Is that possible? And our point of view is that absolutely yes, it is possible. And absolutely yes, it is necessary. That the web of things that we call imagination, that are, as I say, partly intellectual, partly emotional, partly dispositional, can be broken down in so many ways to sets of habits. Habits of the heart and habits of the mind. Now, it doesn't mean that you can just bottle it and, that I've got that in the book here, you can take an imagination vitamin and have it and you're good, right? But it does mean that it is reducible to a set of habits, or the word that we choose to use in the book, practices. Practice, right? When you think about in so many other domains in our lives, sports, right? Sure, there are people out there who are just born free throw shooters, right? Or born to hit a baseball, right? Or born to throw or to catch a football. But it's only through practice that inborn ability actually turns into something. And in the sports world, we accept that without blinking. Of course practice matters, right? I played violin as a kid, and yes, I was pretty good at it naturally from the start. I understood it. It spoke to me. I could get it. But it was only through practice. There are people we know, there are people in this room probably, who are deeply soulful practitioners of meditation, of religious reflection, spiritual reflection. Well, there too, it's not simply that you were blessed from the outset with a capacity for clarity, but practice has mattered. In meditation in any form, it is literally about practice. In yoga, in physical as well as emotional and spiritual flexibility, these things come with practice. And yet, in the realm of imagination and creativity, we don't often acknowledge that that too is a realm where practice matters and practice can move the dial. But it is. And our willingness to be mindful and intentional about practice, not only to be disciplined, but to be voracious, kind of omnivorous about looking at different people in different places and saying, might there be a practice here that I could borrow? Might there be something here that I could take and fold into my practice and synthesize? That mindset is itself a thing that we lose as we grow up, quote unquote. And that we wrote this book in part to really rewind that particular imaginative aging process. So as I say, the heart of the book are these 28.5 practices, and when we get into conversation, we can talk about some of them, but just to give you a quick taste of 2 or 3 of them so that you know what it is that I'm talking about here. One of the practices that we have in the book is called hoarding bits. And this comes from a variety of people, but I was down in California and spent a whole chunk of time with the Disney Imagineers, the team of folks there, actually quite a large group of folks who are responsible for conceiving of and executing every new Disney experience. Like working at Microsoft or Microsoft Research, it's a pretty cool environment. And spending time with some of these Imagineers who are designing the next theme park, designing the next interactive experiences at Disneyland or Disney World, one common theme that arose was the extent to which these people were literally, in terms of the physical layout of their offices and their workspace, but also mentally, incredible pack rats. They hoarded bits. Everywhere they went, there was a little thing. Ooh, I don't know what this is, but I kind of like the way this little umbrella looks. Ooh, I love that logo over here. Oh, what a cool little wind-up toy over here. Oh, what a funny little poster this is. Oh, that little bit of a song I heard there. I love that rhythm there. I'm going to save that as an MP3. And all the stuff where, you go into their offices and it's just this, some of you may know, back in medieval, even times prior to medieval times, in either pre-literate societies or in a lot of religious environments where there were great, detailed bodies of knowledge to learn and to memorize without the benefit of having easy access to a laptop, to a book even. The way that people in those days, one way that they kind of sharpened their capacity for memory was to build what was then called memory palaces in their mind, right? And literally to imagine in their mind a building in which over here in the east wing of the building is all the stuff that I know about medicine. And over here in the north wing of the building is all the stuff that I know about geography and the village that I live in and the land that I'm in. And over here in the south wing of the building of the palace is all the stuff that I've ever learned about botany and about the natural world and so forth. And over here is all the kind of ancient epics and poems that my culture and my tradition, impart to me. And they had this incredible ability in that oral culture to construct these memory palaces. Well, folks like the Disney Imagineers that I spent time with have memory palaces both in their heads and in their offices. And the beauty and the power of them constructing this kind of crazy pack rat environment is not simply that they kind of can't bear to part with some of these little items and bits, but that it sits there as this kind of dormant, vibrating repertoire from which to continuously make random new connections. And so they'll be sitting there as they think about trying to solve problem X, right? And problem X might be, how do we carve this path from, this ride to that ride at Disneyland Tokyo, right? It can be something very mundane and prosaic like that, but as they're sitting there kind of banging their head on the wall trying to figure that one out, they're sitting in their room and they suddenly see this object here and it lights up an idea. And then they turn over here and then they see this sign over here and that lights up another idea, right? It is this physical instantiation of the ways in which our neural nets themselves light up and in the ways in which we make associations and connections. And if you think about in the realm, a different realm altogether of kind of imagination applied, think about a great stand-up comic, right? Robin Williams, right? You watch Robin Williams do something, you turn on his famous YouTube video clip about golf, right? And he's riffing on golf and he's going bing, 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 all these different places and you're like, how does he do it? He's insane, right? But the thing is, what makes Robin Williams a genius is not that he's able to make connections. He's a genius because he can make connections really fast, right? But the way that he's able to make connections in the first place is he too is a voracious hoarder of bits everywhere he goes. And he's got an incredible capacity to fill up a repertoire with little observations, Seinfeldian, Robin Williams-ish observations about the world we live in. And then he's able, because of practice, to randomly and very speedily access those bits and make unseen connections between them, right? That practice of just trying always to make sure what bits you're surrounded with and then trying to figure out new ways to make new connections across them is something that you see in domain after domain. Another practice that I'll just say a word about, just to get your juices flowing, is a practice called challenging your challenges. Some of you may know here in the Northwest a fellow named Eric Lindbergh, who is the grandson of Charles Lindbergh. And like his grandfather, Eric is an aviator and a flight instructor, and he's on the board of the Xprize Foundation and very involved with the creation of this new aviation high school in South King County. And he's a great guy. But one of the things that Eric Lindbergh, his story is a great example of is, for the longest time, being the grandson of Charles Lindbergh made Eric run 180 degrees the opposite way, right? He wanted nothing to have to do with that legacy. He didn't want to have anything to do with aviation. He didn't want to go there. And so all the goals that he set for himself were in domains altogether different from that, right? He was a competitive skier. He was really into sports. He was really into all this other stuff. And it took him a little while as he entered into his 20s and his 30s to realize that by running that hard and that far away from this legacy and the goals and the challenges inherent in this legacy, he was as much a prisoner of it as he would have been had he just stayed there, right, and been trying every day to measure up against Charles Lindbergh. And he realized that he was no more free over there than he would have been over here. And it was the beginning of the dawning of that recognition that made him realize the challenges that I've set for myself are not that great, because I have failed to face the biggest challenge, which is how you accept being a grandson legacy of a great person like that, and how you find your own voice and identity, not because of that, but in spite of that legacy, and in spite of the ways in which people see and hear and encounter you, not as you, but as the grandson of X, right? And that was the greater challenge that he recognized he needed to face, both as a person and as a citizen. And that personal reflection that he had, that he needed to challenge his challenges, is something that then he took into the work that he brought over to the Xprize, right? So the Xprize, which I think most of you probably know about, right, is this prize created a number of years ago initially for the first manned suborbital space flight, right? And it was it was a certain amount of money, I don't know, $1 million, $10 million for the team that could figure it out by a certain period of time. And then that happened, Burt Rutan won that, and they've subsequently created other challenges, right? And one of the things that the people at the Xprize are always asking themselves is, are the challenges that we set challenging enough, right? There is great power in having a challenge award, like $1 million for an Xprize, or your competitor Google and the prize that they had, and all the free labor they got on kind of come up with a good recommendations algorithm, right? Not Google, Netflix, right? The Netflix prize. But all these organizations out there that use challenge awards to stimulate imagination and creativity and innovation, that's great. But one of the things that the folks at the Xprize Foundation, the folks at Netflix recognize they have to do from time to time is ask themselves, are the goals that we're setting audacious enough? Are the challenges that we're putting forth there interesting enough? Are we just getting into a rut of now we're going to do a whole bunch of aviation prizes, cooler aviation prizes, right? And so no, now they've branched out into green technology prizes, into other kinds of prizes altogether. An organization some of you may have heard of called the Buckminster Fuller Institute. Buckminster Fuller, the creator of the geodesic dome. The BFI is this great organization that has taken that same spirit, and they now created a thing called the BFI Challenge, which is trying to challenge people to come up with great, world-changing, cheap, technology-based social innovations around clean water, around reading for the Braille, or reading for the blind, around, you name it, all these different global challenges. And one of the ways, the practices that comes up time and time again is this willingness to step out of the mesh of the work that you're doing and ask yourself, are the challenges toward which I am striving, against which I'm measuring myself, challenging enough? What are they missing? What are the blind spots built into these challenges? And because in a goal-oriented environment like Microsoft, it's a given that you're all hard chargers, that you're all going at the goal that you have, and that you're all trying to make your number or get your thing or get your launch date or whatever it is, right? But it's not necessarily given at all that you're asking yourselves, are these the right goals? Are we driving at the right things? Are we going for the right metrics? The last practice that I'll just talk about, just to, again, give you a taste, as I say, there's 28.5 of them in the book, is one drawn from the world of improv theater, and it's called yes and. And some of you may know in the world of improv, when you get a group of, we could do it right here. If you got 5 of us and we just started doing an improv situation, right? The number one killer of improv sketch comedy is when someone on stage with you says or does something kind of random, kind of weird, and you don't quite know what to do with it, and what you say back to him is, no, da 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 da. The word no kills dead improvisation, right? And so what improv comedy actors are trained to do from the very beginning is never say no, say yes and, right? So you're in this sketch and someone's doing something kind of wacky and they've created this improbable situation and they're giving you this weird dialogue, and then they kind of turn to you and you just say yes and you take it a totally different direction because you don't know what to do with what you've been given, right? But the difference between no and yes and is profound. And you can get this and you can agree as we sit here in this room, and every one of us in the last 24 hours can probably point to one way or another in which we've said no when a yes and would have done the job better. With a coworker, with a kid, with a neighbor, with a mentee, whatever, right? And I think this is one of those practices that is so simple on paper and so hard to do, and so hard to really build into the way you move and the way you operate. Because part of being willing to go to yes and instead of no is being willing to release both control and the illusion of control, right? When you say no, you're at least creating for yourself the illusion that you're in charge of the direction of stuff. At the end of the day, it turns out you're not even, right? But at least it gives you that sense of agency. No, we're going to go this way instead, right? And so yes and, like so many of the practices in this book, are fraught with risk, right? They are fraught with risk. And this is why I want to close by saying this final thought, that one of the points we try to make throughout the book, and certainly at the closing of the book, is that it is certainly meant to be read by you individually as you sit with your hard copy or with your Kindle or whatever it may be, but it is meant to be practiced in the company of others. That imagination, what's going on in each one of our heads is a network, is a complex adaptive system, right? And so the practice of imagination should also happen in a network within complex adaptive systems. That the myth of the solitary geniuses banging away at stuff, having eureka moments, creating things unbidden, completely unforeseen, is just that. It is a myth. All cognition is bootstrapped. All thinking is analogical. All imagining is relating to what others have said, done, what you have thought before, what is kind of out there. And we make sense of the world and we imagine new things based on what we've encountered in the past. And so the more we can think about ourselves as networked together, as being collectively part of an imagination, whether it's within the culture of Microsoft, within the civic culture of the greater Seattle area, within the civic culture of our state, the more powerful and transformative we can be in whatever domain or arena it is that we want to be. It is this recognition, and I can speak to this later in the dialogue too, in some of my other books, this recognition that the myth of the self-made man or woman is something that we need now to banish. We need now to banish. Everybody knows here. I mean, you guys know better than most. In the American popular mythology and the popular culture, Bill Gates is the quintessential self-made man. But if any of you read Outliers, Malcolm Gladwell's book, yeah, Bill Gates had off-the-charts personal drive and intelligence. And Bill Gates had the following: Bill Gates Sr., Mary Gates, Lakeside School, growing up in Seattle, growing up in the United States, growing up in the United States at a time when technology was blossoming such that there might be something called computing. Bill Gates was located in a network and a context of opportunity and imagination, 99% of which he had nothing to do with, right? The 1% he had something to do with, boy, he leveraged that pretty well, right? But 99% he had nothing to do with, right? That was all the context that we all collectively are authors of. And I think that is so fundamental for us to recognize when we think about how we practice imagination, is recognizing the networked, contagious, sideways scaling nature of this stuff. And so, you know, as we have our conversations, as you get a chance to read this book and think about these practices, I beg of you to kind of talk to each other about them. You know, and the conversations can be, that guy Eric Liu was a crock, I hated him. But great, don't just think that to yourself. Get 5 other people and all talk about how you hated this, you know, and talk about what you liked and what you didn't like. You know, that it's doing it in community and in fellowship and creating that networks that will allow us individually to be as imaginative, creative, and innovative as we possibly can be. So thank you very much for having me. With that, I'd love to just open up to comments, questions, dialogue, and what have you. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for coming. I think it's a great talk. I find that there is no dearth of imagination in people. I think we're constantly imagining, role-playing, all that stuff. But I find that there is a challenge with the acceptance of imagination. In fact, that's what I think happens when you're going into those preteen years.
Yes.
Is that you start looking around and you start going, well, what I think is probably too crazy for the rational world around me to accept. And so I better shut up and say what people will want me to say. And then from there on, or you have to have a really strong belief system in yourself, which, if you look at Bill Gates too, he fought enough with his parents to have counselors come in and create a situation in the house where the counselor finally said, this guy's going to win. So, I mean, either you have a strong enough belief system that just says to the world, I don't give whatever,
Yep.
I'm going to do what I want to do, in which case imagination blossoms. Or, I would argue that for 98% of people, they just confirm at some point, and it's you against society, or your imagination against conformist beliefs, which at some point take over or win. How do you get society to accept is probably the question I was pondering. It's not a dearth of imagination. We imagine, we sort of unlearn that skill.
Yes. Yes.
So how do you...
I think that is incredibly well put. We unlearn it, right? And you state descriptively exactly the challenge, right? Certainly from adolescent or from late childhood on, and then as we enter into professions which have their own vocabularies, norms, mindsets about what is and isn't permissible. And then you get into large organizations, right, that have their own bureaucratic imperatives and take on momentum in life of their own. It is many orders of magnitude easier for everybody in this room to think about what kills imagination than to think about what cultivates it, right? Right now, you could just immediately tell me, any of you, about someone or something that's happened to you that stifled imagination, your imagination. And, to your question, well, what do? How do we change society? How do we make it so that the person doesn't stifle that spark, that impulse? I think, there are 2 broad ways of addressing that question. One is about leadership. I think leadership matters, in organizational setting, particularly. If a leader, and I don't mean necessarily the CEO of Microsoft, it could mean the leader of your team of 4, or the leader of your unit at Microsoft, or the leader of your neighborhood association, or of your child's preschool, parent group, or whatever it is. Leadership matters in the sense of having people who create a culture and set a tone in which, this is one of the practices, in which foolishness is okay, right? In which, in fact, it is foolish not to be foolish, right? Where being too conventional gets looked down on, right? The tone that you set in leading in any kind of organization, and this has to do at the end of the day with a word we haven't yet talked about much, failure. Right? Failure is the real F word in American life, I think. You know, we don't like to go there. We don't like to say it. We euphemize it. We talk around it. You know, we patch it up. We create Ponzi schemes to hide it. Right? Failure is a thing we are all running from, and it is the fear of fear in general, but the fear of failure in particular, is one of the greatest preemptive self-editing killers of imagination. And so, you know, as a leader, as someone who is trying to foster a culture, you know, I think having a high tolerance for failure is central. And not just saying, hey, you failed, great, right? I'm not going to punish you. I'm not going to, you know, slap you for failing, but to rather ask people, how can you fail better? How can we fail well, right? And, you know, even in a culture of perfectionists like Microsoft, every one of you knows you cannot forever stave off failure. Failure will arrive, and it may be small or it may be catastrophic, but it will arrive, right? And the only question is what you, your team, your culture, your company do with resilience and adaptability at that moment to convert that failure into the stuff of new invention, right? So I think how we reckon with failure and our willingness to talk about it, to examine it from a distance, you know, in the medical profession, you know, the hospitals have a great kind of built-in thing called M&M conferences, morbidity and mortality conferences, you know, in which it's a liability-free zone and people talk about mistakes they've made. I misdiagnosed this thing, or I kind of didn't do this thing right, or I wasn't sure how to handle this particular patient, and the results were, you know, bad, right? They recognize in that space that you have to create some environment where people can not just hide or want to sweep under the rug the ways, large and small, in which we fail. So I think that's one part of the answer. And that is a lot about leadership and the tones that our leaders set for us and that we set for others, right? But the other thing of it is, I think, you know, as you were saying, I mean, Bill Gates, one of the ways in which Bill Gates is an outlier was his absolute faith in himself and his convictions, right? And so, yes, that is at an outlier level, but all of us can aspire to a, high percentile, if not total outlier level of that same capacity, right? If you think about entrepreneurs in history, business entrepreneurs, civic entrepreneurs, political entrepreneurs, military entrepreneurs, they are people who, on some level, nurtured within themselves this capacity to hold a voice that says, when everybody's running this way and I want to go this way, I'm going to be able to talk myself into not freaking out. I'm going to be able to talk myself into remembering why I think this way is really the right way, right? And I may not be Bill Gates and be able to like browbeat the other 99% into realizing they're stupid and have them come with me, right? I may or may not be that. But if I can at least cultivate that capacity to kind of sustain for myself, I know why I want to go this way. And to have the courage of that conviction, that is a matter more of personal practice than of kind of group contextual leadership stuff that I was talking about earlier. And I think it's cultivatable. You know, it accrues, it accretes. And the more we do it, the more we do it. But yeah, I think you put your finger on what I think is just the, in education, for instance, you know, one of the great ironies of our time right now is that, when you think about the grand geopolitical co-opetition between the United States and China, right, and you look at our education systems, right, in this kind of crazy way, they look at us and they think American kids are so creative and so innovative and unconstrained and free, and so they're knocking on our doors asking, how can we kind of, import some of this secret sauce into our education system, which is rote-driven, drill-oriented, very fact-cramming, and so forth, right? And creates people who know their stuff but don't necessarily know how to solve problems creatively, right? At the exact same time that we're looking over with them, to them with yearning and longing and saying, gosh, we sure could use some more of that drill, some more of that kind of fact-cramming, some more of that kind of test-driven accountability. And there is this kind of, passing of ships element where what we have to recognize is the synthesis, right? And for us, when we talk about imagination first, the title of the book is not imagination only, right? We're not saying just sit there and dream loopy stuff and think of, no, we all operate within environments that have metrics, that have rules, that have processes, that have expectations, and that have outcomes. No one's arguing that we should dispense with those, but it is not only possible, it's necessary if a place like this isn't going to get sclerotic and bureaucratized and top-heavy and too slow to kind of pivot, that you infuse the structures and the units that you have here with that more open, playful, failure-embracing spirit. And I think that is done best not at the scale of 10,000s. It's done best at the scales of tens. Maybe 10 tens at most. But Dunbar's number, the number of the maximum number of an effective, coherent social network that has integrity is about 150. And culture after culture, setting after setting, anthropologically, historically, 150. And so trying to think about how, you may not be able to change Microsoft, but you can change 150 people at Microsoft by how you carry yourself, by how you make choices, by how you decide not to freak out, by how you decide to open up, and listen to people's wacky ideas. You can change 150 people. And if everybody in this room changed 150 people, you'll be eating Google's lunch, real quick. Yes, sir.
How do you personally put some of these principles into practice in your daily life? I actually think there's a lot of imagination here. I think we, came out with a tablet PC and a smartphone before Apple ever did anything called an iPhone.
Yep.
And we just sometimes maybe come up with the idea and have the vision, but maybe fail to put it into practice the way some of our competitors do. So can you talk a little bit about putting it into practice?
Yeah, I will. And then I think embedded in your question, though, is another very interesting, broader organizational question. For me, just in practice, it is recognizing that it's not like when I look at like a given week's calendar that I realize, ooh, this meeting that I have here is going to be a big imagination test, right? And so I better really gear up and prep for this meeting and get all my imagination muscles kind of toned and ready to go for this one, right? It's much more a matter of I wake up and it's time to make breakfast and my daughter comes down and she says something, and in that moment I have a tiny little choice to make about whether I say in response is, stop drawing that picture, we're late, we got to go, or something else, right? It's 100 tiny little choices you make before you're out of the house, right? About whether you are opening to possibility or trying to close it. And so it's not so much that I have a set of totemic magic practices, but just how I weave it into mindfulness every day. I mean, I use that word also drawn from the world of meditation. It is continuous mindfulness. That's for me as a matter of personal practice. I'm very interested in the kind of implied comment and question, when you talk about tablets or smartphones and things like that. And I don't know, I mean, I've not read the case study of, how it was that the iPhone beat, how Microsoft didn't have the first iPhone and so forth. But I suspect, being not a total stranger to the Microsoft culture, having spent time on the media side at least at Slate and MSNBC, that it does have something to do with just the nature of scale and bureaucracy, right? And that, that 150 magic number that I talked about here, I can't emphasize that enough, right? Both in business and in government, and in self-government, right? Like in politics, I spent a lot of time in politics and in American culture, over the course of the last half century, we all as citizens have come to think of ourselves as little things and government as this big thing over there. Now, that's without regard to your ideology. Some of you love that big thing over there and love what it's doing for you, and some of you hate that big thing over there, right? But in both cases, we feel that government is this thing abstracted from us, and into which we have little input, around which we have no influence, and the direction of which we can't change, right? And one of the things that I believe we fundamentally have to do is break apart the scale of civic life, right? And the old saying, all politics is local. I believe all government is local too. And so it's great to have President Obama and the Congress trying to bang away on national, terms and standards for healthcare reform, for instance. But I think there should be radical decentralization of experimentation of how you then implement healthcare reform, right? Same with education reform. Set the standards. I'm not only for, I'm for, the strong state standards we have here. I think it would make sense to have national standards. It's sort of silly to have a race to the bottom between our standards and Mississippi's standards and so on and so forth, right? Having national standards is great, but then having maximum level experimentation, within the operating system of those standards, right? Now bring that to an organizational setup like Microsoft. I mean, how many tens of thousands just in the Redmond area alone? I mean, it is at an unfathomable scale, right? And so I would bet that if I were to do that case study, it would have less to do with people not having imagination, more to do with the fact that this place was not structured in a way that allowed that imagination to flower and that gave people at the unit level, at the small unit level, enough of a sense of ownership, agency, and kind of capacity to be decision makers to kind of push a great idea up, right? Another organization that I've spent a lot of time both in and spent time studying is the United States Marine Corps, right? So people might, from the outside, have this view of the Marine Corps as a big monolithic military thing, this kind of monolith, but it's not, right? The Marine Corps, more than the other branches, has this ethic woven into the way they do warfighting and do their business, in which they train small unit leaders down to the squad level, a dozen people, to know the big picture of what your objective is, of what the strategic and tactical objectives are, and then take initiative and take ownership. And you are rewarded for doing that, because they know that at the end of the day, in the field, you cannot keep waiting for calls to go up the chain to headquarters and then orders to come back down, right? And no knock on Microsoft. It's just the nature of large organizations that more time is spent on waiting for stuff to go up and waiting for stuff to come down. And there's kind of infidelity of transmission as it goes up and as it comes down, right? So by the time decisions get made and, people, you at that unit level, are only half empowered to do only half of what you meant to be asking to do, right? And that kills imagination. Why? Because it kills your motivation, right? If fear and fear of failure in particular is one piece of it, then intrinsic motivation is another huge part. And institutional life can just drain us of the motivation. And if you've had enough times where you've run it up the flagpole and it's come back down half shredded, you're going to be like, you know what? I'm going to apply my imagination at my kid's soccer camp. I'm going to apply my imagination over here. I'm going to apply my imagination, in the screenplay that I'm writing at night, because it's just not worth my energy to keep trying to do it up here and down here, right? And I think, again, leadership matters in trying to tap into the motivation and sense of ownership that people have that says, I got a great idea and I think I could run with this. Will you let me run with this? And the more that leaders at every level can create a culture where that's not even a question, the stronger your results will be. Yes, ma'am.
A couple of motifs are going through my mind. One thing that I often come across in work on creativity is clutter, uncluttering the mind.
Yes.
And I was intrigued by the description you had of people whose environment is what many of us would regard as cluttered. I'm an artist when I'm not here, so my studio space is just a nightmare. I'm always pulling together things for collages I may never get around to make, that kind of thing. And I always think, I need to unclutter all of this so that my mind can just be clear. And yet what you're really describing is something that's the opposite of that. And what I wonder is whether, for that to work, what you have to have inside is the clarity, a practice of clarity in your mind so that the outward clutter doesn't become inner clutter.
Love that. That is, so that...
I have not yet attained.
Well, I don't know that any of us ever totally attains that, but I love that you asked that question. Practice number 1 in the book is called Make Mist. And it's actually another Disney Imagineer whose story yields the name of this practice. This Imagineer whose office and whose work life is as cluttered as we're describing, right? She's trained as a set designer, so she's the one who's really figuring out how to build the stuff, right? Make Mist comes from the practice she has every morning. She gets up before she has to get to her office and be in this kind of buzzy Disney Imagineering kind of environment, and she spends way longer than someone in drought-ridden California should be spending in the shower, making mist, right? And it's her meditation period, and she is clearing her mind, you know, and she literally visualizes the melting away of obsessions, worries of that moment, things that from the moment she popped up, you know, in bed was already kind of starting to make noise, and she lets that stuff melt away in the mist. She visualizes them kind of, and you know, everybody's going to have their own way of doing it, right? Of how you visualize and how you do that stuff. But I agree fundamentally that clearing, you know, I guess I would say this: clearing the mind and having bits and a repertoire of materials from which to construct collages are not mutually exclusive, right? They reinforce one another if you are intentional about the sequence. And you know, this particular woman, Lori Coltrane, was very intentional about the sequence.
Follow up on that briefly. The thing in the workplace that seems a challenge for a lot of us is that we have clutter of information.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, the myth of multitasking.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you had any particular insights about that, because you're talking about the bureaucratic chain of command being a deadener for imagination, but also just having your attention split so many ways can be a real deadener. We all know it, and yet it's the ocean we swim in.
Mm-hmm. It is, and you're right. And I think it is a myth that, I mean, it's a myth that now, right? I mean, there are in fact scientific studies showing that it is a myth, right? That we are, that our capacity to do anything is degraded on all fronts when we have, sorry, multiple windows open in our desktop, right? After a while, we crash, right? And so that is true, and I think that, you know, the art of this, right? Back to someone like Robin Williams, when I talk about the ways in which he can have all these bits and have this very lightning quick random association from one corner to another, that's all happening within the context of his being incredibly focused on collecting bits and on comedy. Right? He's not also thinking about how to run a hedge fund. He's not also thinking about kind of, you know, his garden design. He's not also thinking about this other thing. He's kind of obsessive about, you know, how to generate great comedy, right? And within that, you know, his tactics for doing that are about embracing and capitalizing on the clutter of his bits. But I would agree. I mean, I think that is. Particularly in a technology environment like this, you know, one of my previous visits, I don't see anybody in the room from that visit. I was here visiting with folks from Microsoft Research in the fall, not for a public event actually, but one of the books that's over there that I co-wrote is this book called The True Patriot. My co-author is a fellow named Nick Hanauer, who some of you may know. He's a Seattle-based entrepreneur and investor, and founded a Quantive, which Microsoft acquired, and so, you know, the book The True Patriot was a book arguing that we have to reframe and reclaim patriotism, the idea of patriotism, in terms similar to what I'm talking about here, kind of around values of shared responsibility rather than just kind of chest thumping we're number one-ism, right? Well, we're working on a sequel book that is about kind of a new theory of government, and asking ourselves, in this age now, this moment that we're in history and technology and the changes in society and demography, isn't it time that we refresh the operating system for government, right? And our work is incredibly influenced by this burgeoning field that's cross-disciplinary. I mean, to the point we feel like we're on the cusp of the second enlightenment of complexity theory, the study of complex adaptive systems, and from the world of economics, to the world of anthropology, to the world of biology and epidemiology. You know, this confluence of new ideas around complexity and contagion and network theory make it a super exciting time right now, right? And so we came over to Microsoft Research to visit with Eric Horvitz and some of the other folks here who are engaged in some really interesting work around complex adaptive systems. And Ed Lazowska over at the UW, you know, had put us in touch here. And so we were having this great conversation. And one of the things that struck me as we spent this afternoon with folks from Microsoft Research is how it's a great thing for Microsoft as an organization to have a thing like Microsoft Research, where people can be freed to unclutter and to imagine and to create and to explore things without necessarily the driving pressures of ship dates and what have you, right? And the question that arose in my mind as I thought about that was, how can, you know, in a scalar way, how can every part of Microsoft create its own space where that kind of freedom is also possible, right? Where every unit at Microsoft can have a part of it, or a part of your time, or a part of your weekly practice, where you explicitly and consciously make a choice to close some of those windows, to stop multitasking, and to ask yourselves, what's really interesting right now? Like when I step back, what's going on that that I haven't been paying attention to consciously, but in the back of my mind, I've been noticing a trend is piling up, and that's cool, and there's opportunity here, right? So I think part of it is trying to build into team-level practice and culture the space and the time to do that kind of uncluttering. There was someone else over here that was... Okay. Is there any more? Yes?
I have a question. Can you give some guidance, if you're not the leader, what you can do as a team member to influence the dynamic of a group to make it more open to creativity and imagination?
Did you all hear that question? I think I would answer that question in part by challenging the premise of it. Okay. You may not be the manager of that group with the title of the group, but you can be the leader of it. You can be the leader in terms of how you set a tone, of how you approach a project, how you model asking questions, and how you have offline conversations with the titled leader of the group to say, hey, maybe I just have an idea. Maybe if we did it this way instead of that way, we'd get more ideas. Or if we tried this thing instead of the other thing, right? I think, you know, I partly it's a semantic thing about kind of never too quickly yielding both the mantle and the opportunity of leadership, right? But the other piece of it too is, you know, obviously, again, in a large organization, right? Managing up, right? A skill no one teaches you in school, and yet it's kind of, you know, more than 50% a part of what you worry about, right? And what determines your path and your success in a place, how you manage up. And I think the way I would answer your question, which kind of meshes in with how to manage up for imagination, has everything to do with a particular practice of imagination, which is empathy, right? And imagining yourself in the shoes of this manager, of your team leader, right? Whether you like that person or don't like that person, whether you're agreeing with, you know, them or not agreeing with them, really trying to imagine, if I were them right now, what are the pressures I'd be feeling? What would be the circumstances that would frame up my choice set, right? And trying to get into their heads so that when you try to then say, hey boss, why don't we do X or Y, it's always oriented toward what would make the boss feel more effective and capacious in their work, right? It's not about you trying to show that you've got a good idea. It's about how you can tap into whatever it is that's making the boss feel limited or frustrated or pressured or stressed out, and what can you contribute to helping to make that boss feel less of those things, right? And so tailoring all of your ideas and the framing of your ideas about imaginative work with that in mind, right? It's a win friends and influence people kind of thing, right? I mean, it's just really getting into their head, and because, you know, the higher up you go as you're managing up, right, the more pressure people have to just deliver on results, and the less free they feel to let you practice imagination, right? And so it gets harder the higher we go as we think about the bosses that we have, and so it becomes, I think, all the more imperative that, you know, we don't get oppositional in thinking of, here's the distant boss who doesn't get me, and here's me with all the great ideas, but try to get into their head and ask, if I were them, you know, what would be freaking me out, and how can I kind of feed my good ideas in a way that will make them feel more powerful and not less. Yes?
Yeah, I have a related question, is that, and this is to some degree universal and to some degree more true at Microsoft than other places. We have a very large number of extremely bright people who are nevertheless not particularly articulate and not good at getting into somebody else's head, and even more so, not very good at listening to other people's ideas and absorbing them like that. And that's another skill that needs to be exercised. But you know, what do you do when you find yourself in a situation like that? That you have this great idea, you know it'd do wonderful things, but you can't do it yourself. You have to convince a bunch of people to do it. And you're not capable of convincing them?
That is a great and a profound question, and I know exactly what you speak of. I didn't mention that in my first few years in Seattle, I worked at Real Networks, which, as you know, is linearly descended from Microsoft, right? And had a lot of the Microsoft culture in it. You know, the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? And I think it is true that there are some organizational environments that are just flat out do not reward listening all that well. That is true, right? And so I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish here and say that, you know, if you just set your mind to it, you can, you know, undo completely the DNA of a culture. That said, you know, I guess there's two things I would say. Number one, I keep using this word contagion. These kinds of habits are contagious just by example, right? And so I'm not even talking about kind of oral persuasion of your peers, but just, you know, if you've got a great idea and are able to show it, that it visually, tactilely, right, that this is a cool thing, this works, or this is sparky, right? Then trying to be mindful of doing a network map of where you work, right? I don't know how much time, you know, you have your org charts, but I'm talking about a network map, like who in my organization is influential? Who in my organization is pretty persuasive? Who in my organization has just like so much enthusiasm that, you know, they could be talking about, puppy dogs and you'd be really super interested, right? Who are the people who can be the super carriers of this virus? Right? And if you start thinking in epidemiological terms, and you think the way a public health person thinks about, you think about all the things that we do to contain H1N1, right? And so it's about thinking about the host environment. It's thinking about who are the super carriers. It's thinking about all the little practices that we are kind of asked to cultivate. Cough into your arm and, Purell your hands and all that, these little things, right? Well, now think about what you'd want to do if you wanted to spread the virus, right? And here, in this case, the virus is your good idea, right? Or your imaginative approach to a problem of some sort. You got to do the epidemiological map of your environment here, and ask yourself, where are the most hospitable people? Who are the ones who are most connected to other connectors, right? Is this person, though, really on my side at the end of the day, too much on the periphery of the network to really help make this thing go to scale, right? So I think the first thing I would say is just kind of mindfulness of the networked horizontal environment within which you work, and being strategic about injecting your imagination virus in the right places. But the second thing I'd say, which does go more to your observation about how a lot of people who are brilliant on the science and the technology of what makes Microsoft go may not be as practiced or as brilliant on getting in people's heads or persuading other people and so on and so forth. That too, I guess I would have to say, is to a great extent, to a far greater extent than many of you will acknowledge, malleable and increasable by practice. And I'll give you one example who I know and write about in the book. A scientist, a guy named Mark Roth, who is a MacArthur Genius Award-winning cancer researcher at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. And his field is, and it sounds like science fiction, but it's not. His field is suspended animation, right? He is figuring out ways to so slow the metabolism and so slow the activity at the cellular level that you are able to, stop a tumor in its tracks. You are able, in a traumatic instance, if somebody's kind of, severed a leg in a car accident or on the battlefield or something, kind of so slow them down that you have time to get them to critical care, right? And so he's doing all this incredible work and this incredible research, and it was just genius stuff. And for the longest time, people didn't know about it, right? Because, number one, he wasn't super skilled at managing up and working the, all the bureaucratic politics. But number two, he wasn't all that practiced at telling the story, right? And he felt kind of intimidated about, in fact, quite intimidated about telling the story of what he was doing. And what he decided at a certain point, his work was getting funded and everything, but what he decided, and what helped him make the breakthroughs was he literally sought instruction. He went to the people who run PR at the Fred Hutch and said, can you find me somebody who's really good at coaching people on public speaking, communication, written communication, persuasion? And with the same intensity that he brought to bear in cancer research, he began to focus on improving his ability to communicate and to persuade. And he went from 0 to 60 really fast by practicing. And he had practice sessions of every kind. How to practice in a meeting setting, how to practice in a public talk setting, how to practice in a media interview setting, how to practice in a large speech setting, right? And just practice. And he failed, and he failed, and he failed, and he stunk, and he failed well. And every round and every way, he got a little better at this stuff. And so now it's just second nature for him, right? To be able to infect other people with enthusiasm for his ideas, right? Now again, maybe Mark Roth is an outlier, right? But every one of us can raise our game. Every one of us can raise our game if we commit to practicing on these things. It's just identifying, as you just did, that, maybe there's an instance, maybe there's many instances where the problem isn't the absence of an imaginative idea. The problem is the comfort with the skill set to infect others with this idea. Practice. And I think that that word is a pretty great way to end the conversation. I urge you to carry forth that idea and that spirit. And I'm going to be sticking around here to sign books and happy to continue one-on-one conversations. But again, thank you to Kirsten, to Microsoft, to Kim Rickett's Books for being here. And thanks to all of you for making the time this afternoon.